Good evening, good evening, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Policy Pulse, the education edition, where we break down what's happening in K 12 education so you stay informed, stay empowered, and most importantly, you stay ahead. Now, we know that education policy can feel overwhelming. There's a lot of noise, a whole lot of headlines, and sometimes it is really hard to know what actually matters. And that's why we're here. No spin, no fluff, just clear, fact based insights on what's changing and how it directly impacts you, your children, your schools, and your community. So, whether you're a parent, an educator, a business owner, or just someone who cares about the future of education, stick with us. We're going to break it down all together. So let us know where you're watching from in the comments and let's get started. Cecilia, introduce the people to you.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you again on this bitterly cold Thursday here in Kansas City. We know that we're coming everywhere, but we are both. It is cold, 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 cold. It's great to be with you. My name is Cecilia Belzer Patton. I am the founder, cultural curator of Just Systems. Just Systems is a advocacy organization as well as a systems change firm. So we help people get to be who they say they are, and help them along the way by coaching, by empowering with information and knowledge as we are now, and by assisting them in their systems change within their organizations and within themselves.
I
Great to
love it.
be
I
here.
love it. Yes. And so my name is Katina Taylor. I'm the founder and executive director. Let's change that. CEO of Dreams KC. We are an education nonprofit that empowers parents with the tools they need to teach their children foundational literacy skills. However, I'm not necessarily here in that capacity at all today. So please let me say this disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed during this broadcast belong to the individuals, and it does not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of our respective organizations. So we are
Absolutely
here
not.
providing a service to each and every one of you because we understand that you want to know what's happening in education policy. So, again, my name is Katina Taylor. I greet you from St. Louis, Missouri, the middle of these United States. So, I am so excited to be with you all. I traveled early this morning to make sure I was stable and ready to go this evening. And what are we discussing this evening? What are we doing? Last week, we talked about what the administration can do and what they can't do. And when we say the administration, we're talking about the Trump administration, we're talking about the presidential administration. So we're talking about policies that are happening at the national, the state, and or the local level and how it directly impacts you. So this evening we're talking about
Executive orders.
orders, honey. That pen has been going. You hear me? Since January.
21st.
Going,
Going.
swift. I don't think a day has gone by where an executive order has not been signed in some shape, form, or fashion. But we'll specifically talk about the executive orders that relate to K 12 education. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And I will tell you that we have some that are already attempting to reshape K 12 education under this administration. So we know that if you're a parent, if you're an educator, if you are a business owner, again, or you're just someone that's invested in the future of education, this is a conversation that I think you'll want to hear about. But before we get started, let me say this. Be sure to engage with us. Hit that like button, share the broadcast, and invite others to join in. We want to interact and engage with you. We want pushback. We want pull in, all the things. But remember, we want to engage with you as you are that important.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. So it's a lot of confusion going on, Cecilia.
A
A lot
lot.
of
A
strong
lot.
emotions.
A lot of
People,
strong emotions.
yes, people are
And
afraid.
that may be the strategy. So one of the things that we want to really ground us in, as I shared last week, and I will share again today, I'm a restorative practices practitioner as well as a trauma informed practitioner, certified in both those areas. And what I've been trying to say to my executive leaders that I coach: breathe, remain grounded, remain mindful. I can do that much better in business than I can personally sometimes. So I get how it feels where you feel like you're spinning, you're not understanding what is happening with all the executive orders, with all the changes that are moving forward. We must stay, as Katina said, in front of this so that we can be our most proactive selves around these things. So a lot has been happening. It may, in fact, be the strategy to overwhelm us and feel like that we are one tiny person in this, as opposed to a community of people who want the best for our children and our children's families, for that matter, as well. And so, yes, a lot is going on. A lot of distraction is happening. Please do not be distracted. Katina and I, in Policy Pulse, wants us to be very clear so that we can be strategic in how we move when it comes to our children, education, our communities, so that we can do what's best for us.
Absolutely. You said it best. Our goal is really simple. It is to break these executive orders down, these policy changes down in a clear, factual way so you understand what's happening, what's at stake, and what actions are possible moving forward. That's the goal here. So, we're not coming to necessarily provide you with our opinion, our thoughts. We really want you to be able to think critically, armed with relevant information, and draw your own conclusions. Do you support what's happening? Do you not? And then how it impacts you and how you might advocate moving forward. So, this is a very crucial moment. We always say that, right? And so, over the last 30 days, when we think about K 12 education, there have been at least three really significant executive orders, major executive orders that have been issued. And those target school curriculum, diversity, equity, inclusion programs, and school funding options. Let me say that again: curriculum, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, and school funding. So those are the major executive orders over the last 30 days that have been issued. These orders are already influencing policy conversations across the country, specifically in the state of Missouri for sure.
Absolutely.
But they do not, be clear, they do not immediately change federal funding or state level decisions, at least not yet. Mm-hmm. So we want you to be clear about that. Not yet, even though they've been issued, they do not yet impact or change federal funding or state level decisions. Yet.
They blur our minds. They make us feel like that so much is happening, and yet it has not moved forward in ways other than by the power of the pen with our leader, our chief of staff for the country of the United States.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it was so important for us last week. And if you didn't see the episode, please go back and take a look at it. We really wanted to set you all up to understand what is possible, what can or cannot be done by the administration. So you're really clear and you're not being reactive or emotional, but you're acting from a place of power with the information, right?
Absolutely.
So before we react, rather, we want to take a fact-based approach to understanding these executive orders, right? What they do, what they don't do, and what challenges they may face moving forward. So we want to start off by talking. We're just going to break down each executive order, step by step, have some discussion around it. And then we're going to wrap up and let you all return to your lives, right? But feel free to ask any questions, express any concerns, drop some things down into the chat so that we can know, one, that you're watching, you're here with us, hit that like button, share it out. But two, we want to make sure that we address anything that comes up for you as we have this conversation. All right. So let's start with the first one, and we're breaking these down in plain English. Plain English. All right.
Absolutely.
So executive order. Go ahead, Cecilia.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, all
Executive
right.
order is ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling. This executive order, you all, was signed on January 29th, 2025. So a little over, not quite a month ago. And really, it's saying that it's eliminating federal funding for programs deemed to promote illegal and discriminatory treatment and indoctrination. That's loaded language.
That is loaded language.
Eliminates federal funding for programs deemed to promote illegal and discriminatory treatment and indoctrination. It also orders federal agencies to stop supporting programs labeled as promoting discriminatory equity ideology. So, this is very interesting to me. I have often said, as we have been in a time of racial reckoning in the United States, definitely over the last 4 or 5 years. And I would say trying to reconcile with that over the last 10, 15, 20 years, perhaps even 30 or 40. One of the things I share with people is that when you are so used to things moving forward in ways that support you or your family or an organization that you belong to, a part of the country that you belong to. I could go on and on and on, ways in which we identify. That when someone says, hey, there may be some things that we need to look at about you, me, our family, our organizations, our communities, we become tender about thinking about that. And I think that sometimes some Americans are tender when other Americans say, have we been as inclusive and equitable and all the things that we can be to create one United States of America? And people get a certain way about that. An example of that is that we just had one of America's holidays, February 8th, wasn't that the 8th, the Super Bowl? And one of the things around in there, one of the things that came up was, why do they have to sing the Negro National Anthem?
Oh, yes. That did come up a lot.
We're one country. We're one country when it's convenient for some people to say we're one country. And then other times we find ourselves to be very separatist, a lot of things that we are. And so as we're thinking about what is illegal and discriminatory treatment and indoctrination, who's experienced that? What is discriminatory equity ideology? Who's experienced that? I wonder if we told the United States history from the perspective of Indigenous people, might that offend other folks? And so these things are tricky in how they move and what is being positioned forward by the executive orders and administrative orders of our president. And I'll let you jump in there too, Katina.
Yeah, when you talked about this loaded language, right? So what is that? That's a lot of let me go back to it, because I was like, wait, what?
Let me read it. Illegal and discriminatory treatment and indoctrination. This orders federal agencies to stop supporting programs labeled as promoting discriminatory equity ideology.
I think that these things are broad, undefined, and they allow. Now, this is my legal background, right, and my political science background in terms of how things are written and then the impact that they could have. So not necessarily my commentary. So let's break it down. So they want to stop what the administration calls radical indoctrination in schools, particularly regarding topics about race, gender, and equity. So where's the definition of radical indoctrination? That would be my first question. And I think that's a question we have to ask and determine whether or not it has been defined. So that's one. Two, it directs federal agencies to develop strategies to cut funding for schools that teach concepts the administration deems as discriminatory equity ideology or gender ideology. So, what does that mean for our female identifying, female born students, right? Or those of color? And again, it's what the administration deems. So, where has that been defined? What are those characteristics? What are the ideologies that we're speaking of here? That's another question, right?
Yep.
And then it's defined. Oh, and so then as you walk down through it, it says, okay, those are the questions. So how are we defining this? So the order defines discriminatory equity ideology as teaching that treats people as members of preferred or disfavored groups rather than as individuals, or that presents the U.S. as fundamentally racist or discriminatory. So, what does that mean for our history teachers, Cecilia, in terms of the way in which they can deliver instruction from a place of truth and fact of what has occurred in this country?
Well, I think as a person, and I think we both were humanities teachers, as a person who has taught English, secondary English and secondary history, as well as been an administrator K through 12, I think one of the things that it inhibits our teachers who are trying to give a robust, well-rounded, clear and truthful view of his story, it really moves to his story and her story as opposed to an inclusive lens of history. And so we see things in textbooks now that say that Africans who were enslaved were willing immigrants and refugees to the United States. When we have
when I think about this, one second, Cecilia, when I think about this, I'm also asking myself, like, well, what does that mean when we start teaching about the internment of Japanese Americans? Or what does that mean when we perhaps approach the subject of the Holocaust? What does that mean when we talk about migrant farm workers? Like, what does this mean?
What does it mean when
all
we're
in groups?
Absolutely. What does this mean when we are in places like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, I would say even Nevada, California, when people are part of indigenous communities that moved south and became what we now know to be Mexican Americans or Mexican nationals, and are trying to learn about themselves? What does that mean, right? What does it mean when people are trying to lean into a more holistic view of history? It means
just like truth. Can we just not have truth?
Yeah, evidently not. Because I think that one of the things that we are most interested in is mythology, the symbolism of America, definitely of who she can be, and not who she was during those times.
It's very interesting. I remember not too long ago hearing someone say that if someone can control the narrative of history, they can control a society. Mm-hmm. And I want, so it's just very interesting that this is happening right now. I mean, I know that it was coming, but again, I'm like everyone else, right? And it's just interesting. I will further say that mentioned in the executive order is this notion around patriotic education, which should present what they call an ennobling view of American history and founding principles. The order also reestablishes the President's Advisory 1776 Commission, which, remember, was created during his first term in office to promote patriotic education. And it was directly assembled, put together after the 1619 project was made available to the public, if you all
Absolutely.
remember that. It also, this executive order also suggests that teaching concepts like white privilege, white fragility, unconscious bias promotes racial discrimination and potentially violates civil rights laws. And last but certainly not least, the order also addresses gender related issues, aiming to restrict discussions about gender identity in schools and limit access to gender affirming care for students without parental consent. So that's the executive order in a nutshell.
Mhm.
Any thoughts? Any additional thoughts? Did I leave anything out? You think I hit everything that we
Mm,
needed to hit with that one?
I think you did. And I think one of the things that I want to say to people as they are working themselves around how to be present and active in this is that we recognize that these issues can be very, very tender. They're very can be very nuanced. They're not black and white.
Mhm.
And we want to encourage all of us to lean into that discomfort that we might feel about a certain component. Katina and I have been talking around our practice and our praxis as educators and veteran educators as we grow and as we continue to develop and mature. And I hope that I'm not sharing something, Katina, that you did not give me permission to share. If that is so, just stop me and I'll stop. And
Okay.
thinking about the ways in which, as we get older, maybe we become more conservative, maybe we become more progressive, some of us, maybe all of those things are things that we have to also consider as we're trying to understand and wrap our heads around, and hopefully our hearts and our hands around how we
Mhm.
move forward with the ways in which we advocate against some of these really constricting uh, orders.
Absolutely. But no, I think you're absolutely right. I think we, every nothing stays the same. Everything is an evolution. And when you're self-reflective, you may determine that something has changed about you, the way you critically think about particular issues, and that certainly has been my journey. And I think it's just because I'm thinking deeper about things as they come up. So we've shared with you this executive order number one, ending racial indoctrination in K-12 schooling. What does this really mean? So it means that programs that focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion may, big word, may lose funding. So
Perhaps.
if you have a black student council, or like a African American student council, or maybe there's some student activity funds that are going toward gender affirming groups, like that funding may have to be redirected. May, I keep using may, have to be redirected if in fact this type of executive order is upheld. Schools that rely on federal grants for curriculum development could see changes in how those funds are distributed. They may be checking what curriculum have you adopted? Is it in compliance? If it's not, we're going to divert, your funding until you get something that's more in compliance, those types of things. And this particular executive order will and has, and I'm sure will continue to face some legal challenges for potentially violating federal protections on education programming. So we're
What?
again just giving you what the order is, what it says, and what it may mean. Because remember, just because it's an executive order that's been issued doesn't necessarily mean that implementation has begun yet. Go ahead, Cecilia. I know you were going to add something to that.
Well, and we have to be very clear about the fact that I think we cannot stress enough may, perhaps, could be, um, all of these things that show how nebulous these executive orders are and how they will be able to move forward, and if they will be implemented in certain spaces. What I do think that we have to be aware of, for those of us who have children in Kansas City public schools and other school district, KCK public schools, that rely heavily on federal funding and state funding, these are tools that can be implemented. Can be, maybe, perhaps will be. It doesn't mean that they will. There's some meat to them if people want to move forward with that. And I think that these, all the more reason why we have to become more knowledgeable, more active in our advocacy and in our action around then how these things are applied, how they're implemented, because children in Kansas City, Missouri public schools and Kansas City, Kansas public schools are dependent upon this federal and state funding that can be eradicated under these orders.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and go to the next executive order. It was also signed on January 29th, 2025. It expanded.
What day of the week was that?
Man, I tell you, that was like the K-12. That was like, this is the education week. This is the education week. So it was this expands educational, was said to expand educational freedom and opportunities for families. So specifically, it encourages federal funds to be directed toward more school choice options. So what does that mean? That means expansion of school voucher programs, charters in some areas, etc.
As well as, which is different than what has happened in the past, though, Katina, it also expands that funding to private and religious schools.
Yes. When we clearly have a separation of church and state. Yes. So yeah. It directs the Department of Education to explore new ways to fund scholarships and vouchers. So are we going to be seeing private money come into play? Like, what is this going to look like? New ways to fund. What new ways? I don't know. It involves other federal agencies like Department of Health and Human Services in developing plans to support school choice.
Where this is tricky, as a person who's worked on campaigns, ways in which we move things forward through Health and Human Services, through our social agencies, this is very tricky. It's very tricky when you start to recognize who funds things, who funds campaigns, who are really instrumental in pushing, talk about ideology, an ideology forward. And then now they're more attached to how we educate our children.
Talk more about that, Cecilia. Talk more about that. Like, and just make it plain. Like, the facts.
One of the major objections. One of the major funders of the reproductive justice campaigns that went up against Yes on 3, the opponents of Yes on 3, was the Archdiocese of Missouri. So the Archdiocese of Missouri, which is the Catholic Archdiocese of Missouri, funded women not having and girls not having autonomy over their bodies. And I would imagine now may have the opportunity to get more money from federal agencies when it comes to school choice. So private schools, private religious schools, those types of things. So it's a very murky line that we are, a slippery slope, I think, that we are going down, as the politicians would say, right, Katina? A very slippery slope as we move forward in the possibility of legislating this type of intersection. Yes. And so it's almost counterintuitive to the executive order that we just heard about not spreading certain ideology, and yet making it easier for the intersection of ideology when it comes to religious and private education. And educators, districts, families, students. I find that to be something. Now, I'm gonna throw a wrench in the game here too, Katina. Now, this is one of those spaces where someone as polarized, I would say, in a
Yes.
nice way.
Yes.
As the President Obama's administration and President Trump's administration agreeing on things, because people don't recognize that the Obamas were very pro-choice, pro-school choice, funding that. That is a history that comes out of Chicago, going back to Marva Collins and her private school. I don't remember the name, the exact name of Dr. Collins' school, but that was very lauded because she did help children. I would say all children. People like to focus on Black children, but she admitted all children that wanted something different than Chicago public schools. So they come out of a climate and a community where school choice is it was one of the first school choice spaces, Chicago was. And so these two very opposing, I would say, politically opposite viewpoints agree on expanding school choice, which I think is very interesting.
It absolutely is. And I want to go kind of break it down step by step, bullet by bullet, this particular executive order. So we're talking about executive order number 2 as it relates to K-12 education, expanding educational freedom and opportunity for families, right? So 1, it directs federal agencies to support parents in choosing where and how their children are educated beyond just public schools. So that's 1. 2, it states that the Department of Education must provide guidance on how states can use federal funds to support school choice programs. It prioritizes education freedom in federal grant programs, potentially making more money available for school choice initiatives. The order allows for the use of federal funds, including those for military families and, interestingly enough, Native American students to attend private, faith-based, or charter schools.
Now,
before you jump in there, because I'm like, that's really interesting, because what I do know for sure is the Department of Defense has some of the highest performing schools in existence in this country.
In existence, both nationally and internationally.
They have a lot of perks and things, resources flowing into them. So it's very interesting that now you're saying, well, military families, even if you are getting already the cream of the crop, we're going to boost that for you. Should you choose to have faith-based schools, charter schools, attend private schools, we're going to figure out a way to fund that. That's very interesting to me.
It's interesting to me as well.
And then when you think about Native American students, Cecilia,
and the history of intentionally taking Native American students from their families, from their tribes, from their regions, and putting them in boarding schools where they were renamed, they were, their culture was stripped from them, and things like cutting hair, things like, again, like I said, renaming, things like really faith practices, a type of brainwashing that said what you come from is not as good as, because that's the underlying message, right? It's wrong. These types of things, and
they were meant to be civilized in those schools.
Were meant to be civilized. That was the language that was utilized, right? So to make them oftentimes taken away from their families as young as 3, 4, 5, so they lost language. A lot of different ways in which they were indoctrinated. Again, words that are in
identity.
Words that are in the former executive order that are asked not to ideology, indoctrination, all of these things. And yet we have this that is moving towards that once again, but a more patriotic and religious indoctrination. What I also think that people should be very aware of, Katina, is that this is happening without the type of microscopic control that public schools go through.
Yes.
Without the governance, without the accountability measures in place, without all of the things that public schools have to go through in order to continue to get funding, for their accreditation to be in place, all of the different things that have to occur there,
Yeah.
are not
Yeah,
legislated
you have no
when it comes to
accountability
private,
measures.
charter, and other schools.
Yeah, you have no accountability for private schools and faith-based schools in terms
Absolutely.
of oversight, right?
Oversight is the word I
Yeah,
was looking
I mean,
for. Thank
I
you.
worked for almost a decade in a private faith-based school, so I certainly understand that. And please understand and know that when we use the term public school, we understand that charter schools are also a type of public school. What we're referencing when we use that language is the traditional public school. So please be clear about that. There's a couple of more
And
points.
also be clear about the fact that charter schools do not have the same oversight as
They do
traditional
not.
public schools do.
Absolutely
So
not.
the ways in which, and we've seen this run through all of our communities where charter schools are prevalent: St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, New York State, Colorado, New Orleans, oof, California. With that oversight, there can be with that lack of oversight, excuse me, there can be a way in which the things that public schools are required to do, which is educate children, charter schools can elect to not educate a child and its family. They have ways in which they can cherry pick that child and the family out of their community legally in ways that traditional public schools cannot.
Yeah, you're right. So let me run down these last few bullet points. So this particular executive order also aims to expand options for low income families to choose alternatives to their assigned public schools. The Department of Health and Human Services must explore how certain block grants, those community development block grants, can be used to support educational alternatives. But again, it doesn't immediately change school funding or curricula, but it certainly sets a direction for expanding school choice options. Now, I'm going to give a caveat to that because, right, when our new governor in the state of Missouri was sworn into office, one of the first things that happened was that there was a diversion of funds. One, our school funding formula was not fully funded. That's one thing. And then two, $50 million from the education budget at the state level was directed for charter schools in the state of Missouri. So remember, we told you all last week, only about 13-14% of funding comes from the federal government. The rest of that comes from state funds and local funds. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about $50 million, a significant portion of the budget in terms of education going to charter schools here in the state of Missouri. So just be aware that governors who are also conservative or aligned with our current administration are taking action at the state level based on some of these executive orders, even though at the national level, they may not be yet implementing or changing school funding at that level, but the states certainly are and can. Anything you want to add to that, Cecilia?
No, because I want to actively lean into my journalistic and communications background and choose to be objective as opposed to subjective in all the ways that we're speaking here.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Walker says that what's happening is that these executive orders create a way to save money for families to go to private schools, including religious schools. He said this other comment, democracy is certainly being tested right now. And as a result of this funding shift, these executive orders, if and when implemented, especially at the national level, then it really is going to depress public education even further, right? Withdrawing resources from these schools. It makes me think about the initial arguments that were made in Brown v. Board of Education about the equitable distribution of resources.
Yes.
right? Like that was the argument. It wasn't about integration. It was more about the equitable distribution of resources. And so as we think about the shifting of resources away from the traditional public school, in which students and families make up the primary attendance at those schools, it begins to we should, are we going back in time to pre,
And I think we have to ask ourselves, Katina, like all these things can sound great, right?
Yes.
Like saving money for families that may not have the resources to go to private schools or to go to religious schools of their choice.
Mm-hmm.
Brown versus Board of Education sounded good too, until it was implemented by people that might not have had the mindset, the wherewithal to objectively do the things around resources that was being asked to be done.
Yeah.
Because what we know is that there used to be a time when people were taught by people in their communities. They were taught by people like Katina that had a Juris Doctorate or a PhD at the K through 12 level. And what then happened through Brown versus the Board of Education, this little bit of history in case people don't know, those people were stripped of jobs and then replaced by other folks that may not have had the same level of education, but were who the governments, the state and local educational entities deemed to be better, simply because they were of a dominant culture.
Absolutely. And I will say that, in one of the, sometimes I like to think of it in terms of like, what are the intended consequences and then the unintended consequences, right? And we have to be really careful of thinking about what can happen short term, what's a short-term impact, what's a long-term impact or consequence when we think about executive orders, proposed policy, legislative action, etc. And so oftentimes, like, people get really upset to hear a lot of people reevaluate Brown v. Board. And, hindsight 2020, sometimes you could take a look back and go, oh, this happened. Well, immediately, what happened when Brown v. Board was passed is about 50% of Black educators lost their jobs. Simply because white teachers didn't want to work alongside them, or they often said that they felt embarrassed working alongside Black teachers who had master's and doctorate degrees, but had been forced to go into the field of education because they couldn't use their degrees in other capacities, right? And it made them look bad, feel bad, all of these things. And it's just like, well, step your game up. But that's commentary. I ain't gonna get no commentary. I promise. I said I'm not doing it.
We weren't gonna do it. We said we weren't gonna do it. Yes, so these things have happened. Or there are people who do not utilize objectivity in doing their jobs.
Yeah.
That are moving from a very subjective place of, I believe this to be so it's so.
Yeah. Versus just looking at the data. Like, we want to be data driven when it benefits us instead of just being data driven all the time, right?
All the time.
All right. So what does this mean? So again, this executive order number 2 allows families to use could allow families to use federal dollars for private and religious schooling. I'm looking at my notes to make sure I get y'all the right points. It potentially shifts funding away from public schools, and it's critical to think about this because it then affects districts with already limited resources, right? And it could lead to court challenges because we know federal funding for religious institutions certainly raises constitutional concerns. So that's executive order number 2. Let's get into executive order number 3. You want to introduce that one, Cecilia?
Sure. Let me get back. You can go ahead, Katina, because I moved out of half screen. Let me do that.
Okay, you're fine. So executive order number 3, ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs and preferencing. That's what it is. So what does it say? So it says that it ends all DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and here's another one, accessibility programs within federal agencies. So veterans, so those who are dyslexic, right? So those that have some type of impairment, perhaps one that can't be seen, neurological, some that can be seen. What about our blind, our deaf, our handicapped in some way individuals, right? Certainly at the federal level, it says, hey, and a lot of veterans have lost jobs. It could indirectly impact education policies related to diversity and hiring in public schools. We know that to be true because right along with this executive order, we have an organization that is said to be grassroots, but when you look, and they do not disclose their funding, however, people have been able to do research and find out who funds them. It is a significantly conservative think tank, which we'll be talking about that, you guys. We're not going to get into a lot of depth today, but what they have done is they've waited for these executive orders to be signed, and then they start going across the country asking for federal investigations. And one of those investigations has been asked to happen against Kansas City Public Schools in relation to the Blueprint 2030, their strategic plan, and their desire to diversify, make their teaching workforce look like the students and families that they serve. Right?
Absolutely.
I'm gonna leave it right there. Just know that while a certain action may not be taken at the federal level, again, our state or our local level can be impacted because they was ready, baby.
They were ready.
You talking about good strategic planning? You talking about good strategic planning? That's what good strategic planning looks like. I'm just gonna say that. I'm not.
It's
I'm
like
not saying I support anything, but it's cool.
In case people like this is,
we hear you, but we don't see you, Cecilia. We lost your face.
I'm coming. Let me.
It said. Okay. It popped. There you go. There you are. You there?
It was saying your internet is inconsistent. Unstable. You know how it does that? Unstable. Yes. In case we were wondering what the plans that we have been hearing about for the last year, Project 2025, others, how the strategy of them were going to be implemented, we're being able to watch it in real time.
Absolutely. For sure.
And what I would say is those of us who believe in a more inclusive strategy, that we should be as strategic as folks who are trying to decrease our privileges and our openness and our truth telling in our history as well. And I think that's something that we can learn from this.
I want to dig down into the meat of this particular executive order because I saw a post today and someone was like, I don't understand why people are losing their jobs that work for the IRS. Well, here we go. When you start talking about terminating all diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs in federal agencies, you're talking about positions like your chief diversity officer. You're talking about eliminating any type of equity action plans. You're talking about eliminating environmental justice offices, DEI.
You're talking about doing things like identifying people. Many of us know about ERG groups or affinity groups in our workplaces of employment. Being able to go back and look and see, Katina is an advocate and a volunteer in the African American Women's ERG at such and such employment agency that happens to be federal. That could be deemed a diversity, equity, inclusion, or accessibility program or higher. So all of this seems like, I could lose my job. I could lose my job for being able to say, this is my identity, and I really would like to meet other people in my very large organization that share the same identity as I do, so that we can help to really increase our visibility, our ability to network, build relationships, our ability to ascend in our organizations by this community service that we're providing. All of those things.
And the other thing that strikes me as I was listening to you talk is we have to be very clear and honest with ourselves about who has benefited most from affirmative action or DEI initiatives. And generally, it has not been people of color.
No.
Now, have they been given positions and titles, which I hate oftentimes, like chief diversity officer and things like that? Yes. And I won't say given, they've earned it. Right? Let's be clear. But most of the time, it is not people of color or people from so-called minority groups that benefit from these programs and these initiatives. It actually is white women, first and foremost.
So, would you like for me to give you the percentage? Because you know that I know this.
Yes.
78%. Yes. The benefit has happened with 78% of white women.
And so as I think about this, so basically the argument is, let's do away with affirmative action and DEI, and people will only be judged on their merit, right? Like they will be given positions and things based on their merit. Well, prior to affirmative action, that was supposed to be what was happening. And clearly it was not. That's why affirmative action and DEI initiatives were put in place.
And in case there's something that moves in us that makes us feel like, oh, that's untrue, that's not so, we have terms, language that we use around ensuring that merit base was not how people were included. Good old boys club, good old girls club. So we were not merit based. We're very who is adjacent to this community, who is proximate, who is in this community, that we can lift up because they're a part of our club.
Yeah, and if we want to be truly merit-based, that's fine. But understand and know who are the most educated individuals in this country right now, and have for a long time.
African-American women since the early 1980s.
So we're going to just
while pure merit of education, experience, often also the most underpaid when it comes to how that correlates.
So if this is going to work from a merit-based perspective, then what we should see, right, as a direct result, is an increase in the pay for African-American women and elevation throughout federal agencies. That's what we should see. Now, whether or not we see that or not is a different question, but that's what we should see. Let me keep going with this. So this is executive order number 3, right? So it directs the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to help with help from the Attorney General and the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, to carry out the removals of these job positions immediately. Agency heads must complete the actions within 60 days. So by March 21st, all of these individuals that have these type of programs, initiatives, or position titles should be eliminated. The order revokes several previous executive orders, including one from 1965 that required affirmative action plans in federal contracting. What does that mean for minority suppliers? I'm just saying. Federal contractors are given 90 days to adjust to the new requirements, or that convenience clause may be invoked, right? The order aims to redirect focus towards what the administration calls merit-based opportunity and away from DEI initiatives. And it frames DEI programs as wasteful and potentially discriminatory, arguing they undermine national unity and individual merit. Just want to throw that out there. So this is certainly a significant shift in federal policy, effectively dismantling DEI efforts that have been in place for decades across government agencies. And even with those DEI initiatives, if you were to look at the data, well, the agencies still weren't representative of the community. I'll say that.
The communities that they resided in.
Yes.
And if we want to look at one of the things that happens with the removal of what some people may deem as affirmative action hires over the last 30, 40 years, it helped to create the Black, brown middle class.
Yeah.
And if we are looking at ways in which those folks are being removed from the equation, please know that Mr. Elon Musk is one of the largest federal grantors of vendor work for the United States federal government. So if you think about, I'm riffing here. So just so we know, I'm riffing. This is hypothetical. Say that because Cecilia and Katina had a very large federal contract with the agricultural agencies, where we were doing some type of research or some type of development or doing something with farmers, and we are removed from that. And then all of a sudden, one of the world's wealthiest men, $487 billion at their disposal, decides, hey, there's now this gap that Cecilia and Katina used to have, but I have $487 billion where I can hire some people to do this research, to do these things, and I can fill this gap. Has no one thought about that?
So I think, Cecilia, like you ask really good questions. And I think that's what our job is to do, is to get people to really start asking questions, thinking deeper about these things, and not just seeing them on the surface and going, well, why is that a problem? Or that's not really a problem, when it truly could be in implementation, and again, short-term and or long-term, intended and or unintended consequences. So one of the things I wanted to point out in terms of like this last executive order that we're discussing here is like, what does it mean, right? Like, what does it mean? So potential cuts to grant funding and professional development programs focused on equity and inclusion, which interestingly enough, I've been in school settings, education settings, where teachers that don't look like me are like, I don't want to do it anyway. So, and about 76%, I was looking at the data the other day, about 76% of our teachers are white women currently across the country.
White women ages 25 to about 35, actually.
Yes, yeah. This could also reduce support for historically marginalized students in public education. So we're talking about our transgender students, our Hispanic students, our biracial students, our Black students, our students with disabilities as well. And this, again, of course, could face legal challenges and policy challenges as states begin to start setting their own policies as a result of this particular executive order. So just want you all to understand and know like what it means for you, your district in this moment, what it potentially could mean for you. So we are actually, we're running a little over, better than last time, but we are definitely running a little over. So we want to begin to wrap up. So I think one thing we want to certainly point out to you all is that these executive orders certainly signify a shift in federal education policy. But state and local governments still control most school funding and policies. So let's remain hopeful. If you're in a state that may have a different governor that has a different viewpoint, I'll say that. Legal battles will continue over these executive orders. Nothing is necessarily set in stone, although we are seeing some direct results like employees losing their job that work in federal agencies.
And
In the
also
K-12 systems, these are not federal agencies, right? So you're not seeing individuals necessarily yet lose jobs. So executive
also
orders.
seeing some mimicking, Katina, and we won't be talking about this today, but this is something that we'll be talking about later, is how some of our state governmental officials that are just happen to be in the same party as our president may mirror and mimic some of his executive orders at the state level.
Yes, and that's something we need to be keenly aware of, watchful, right? So remember, we said you're supposed to stay empowered, stay informed, and most importantly, stay ahead. So you should be reaching out to your representatives at the state level, at the local level, asking those questions we talked about last week. What do you believe in? What do you stand on? Are you representing our community interests versus your own political party interests and viewpoints and things of that nature? So remember, that these legal battles, these challenges to the executive orders don't automatically change laws or override state education policies. There need to be changed. They'll have to be changed at the state level if we're going to see these things through. I will say that the push for school choice and defunding equity initiatives will be a major focus of this administration's agenda moving forward. We are clear about that. It has been said, and we are seeing through these executive orders that it will continue. So the question becomes, what can they do, Cecilia? What should they be doing right now?
You mean our audience?
Yes, our audience. Yes.
I was wondering if you're going to make that broad and let me say, what should our elected officials and folks like that do?
No, our audience. They are not our audience.
They're not. Our audience, definitely. We want, one of the reasons why when Katina asked me to do this, I said yes, is because I think one of the things that I am most concerned about in our society is how small we tend to feel individually. How oftentimes I will hear people say, when I say something to them about voting, or when I say something to them about a lot of different things, they will say, I'm not doing that. It doesn't matter anyway. One of the things that we want to make sure that we help us to recognize is that we are stronger in community. We have to become educated around what is happening around us so that we can, if we so choose, change it. We can be a part of the decision making that happens for us, about us. There's a reason why FUBU is what FUBU is and was, for us, by us. So what are the ways in which we can be more informed, we can be more knowledgeable, and as we say, to get in front of these things? Because I think sometimes we forget that our elected officials work for us. Donald Trump works for us, and not just some of us. Our Governor Kehoe works for us, not just our elected officials that are local to us. They work for us. And so what are the ways in which we can move forward in community, that same strategic way that we'll be highlighting around the organization that is moving forward with Kansas City Public Schools next week? How can others be just as strategic, be just as diligent, be just as insistent around the things that they want for their children, their families, and their communities as well? And so what we want us to do is take this bit of information that we give and then go drag it yourself, research it, read about it, prove us wrong, say, no, Katina and Cecilia, you didn't get that right. And so we can talk about it. We're not the only, I'm not an expert here, even though some would consider me an expert. I would say I'm a person who is a citizen that really wants to be engaged in conversation with my other community members around what we can do to make sure that we are doing the things that we need to do for our students and their families.
Yeah, and what I'll say is, whether you agree or disagree, the most important thing is to understand what's happening and to make informed decisions. I think that's what Cecilia said in a nutshell. And then invite more voices into the conversation, into the discussions, right? The future of education certainly depends on those who are willing to engage, ask questions, and take action. And so all of us have to be a part of the conversation, even those that you disagree with. Diversity of thought is important. It pushes your own thinking. It may give you an opportunity to see things from someone else's perspective. I think Dr. Nicole Price would say it can develop your level of empathy that is needed and necessary to navigate these unsure, uncharted waters, things that we have not dealt with in our lifetime. You know what? So I tell you again, this thought. So my thought just was like, for a really long time, there's been a lot of conversations about young people being so far removed from movement work, right? Mobilization work, organization work,
organizing.
Now we find ourselves in a space where a resurgence is absolutely going to happen in their lifetime.
And I don't even know if that is happening. And I don't even know if that was ever, in fact, the case. I just think that sometimes, folks don't know where that's happening. There's always been underground movement and things like that.
Absolutely. But there is. The underground is very different than above ground, right?
Above ground, right?
And certainly seeing it in a different way.
Absolutely.
For sure. Yeah.
So and there is.
Go ahead.
No, I think all the ways in which my mother used to say it takes all of us. It takes the Al Sharptons as well as the Barack Obamas. It takes the Cesar Chavez as well as the Dolores Huertas. It takes the folks who seem like they are wanting the same thing but saying different things. It takes all of us to move the ball forward.
I mean, move the ball. Ain't that what Nicole say? Move the ball Monday. We ain't even on Monday, but look, there we go. It's coming up. What I will say to you all is one, thank you. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for hitting that like or subscribe or follow button. Thank you for inviting other folks into the conversation. Even if it's not during the time in which this broadcast is happening, if it's at your house, if it's on your job, if it's at your church, if it's at your neighborhood association meeting, these conversations should be happening. So thank you for having those conversations. Thank you for arming yourselves with accurate information. And thank you for taking action in your sphere of influence. So we're going to wrap up today's Policy Pulse Education edition. This is only episode number 2. I'm very excited to continue the conversation for sure next week. Same place, same time. We hope that this has helped to bring some clarity to what's happening in education policy and what it means to you. But again, staying informed is just the first step, y'all. The real power comes when we use this knowledge to make decisions, to advocate for what matters, and ensure our voices are heard. Cecilia, do you want to say something before we sign off for the night?
Everything that we need. We have, you all. Everything we need. So become informed, become knowledgeable, and then let's move together. There's an African proverb said, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go long, go together. Let's go together. I would hate for us to be having these same conversations 20 years from now. Katina and I will be old and gray 20 years from now. And some of these young people will be, not so young. So let us have different things that we are moving the ball forward on 20 years from now, because we are going together long and we are doing the things that we need to do. That's best for all of us, not just for some of us.
Absolutely. Let's continue to push for the best in education for all of our children, no matter what they look like, what they sound like, where they live, what zip code they occupy. And until next week, you all, I don't know. We have to come up with a catchphrase, right?
We do. It's only the second week. It's only the second week. We will.
Absolutely. So you all have a great evening. Thank you for tuning in. Share this broadcast, and we'll see you next week.